Hi, my name's Camilla, and welcome to Deckled Edges, which is my new podcast centered around reading. Here, I get to combine my two favorite things, which are talking to myself and reading aggressively long novels. Join me in bi weekly conversations about my favorite books, poems, or even something completely unrelated, but I promise you it will always be interesting, and we will always have a really great time during our time together. I would encourage you to make some tea. Get comfortable, do the things that make you happy so that we can sit down and have some really great book talk. If you're like me and you are a lover of all things high fantasy, epic fantasy, Brandon Sanderson, or if you like any other genre under the sun, because I promise you that is not just what we're going to be talking about here, then buckle up and buckle down because we have a lot to cover and I'm so excited to share it with you. Another thing, even if you're not an avid reader, if you've never really had an interest in reading before, my goal with this show is to be able to encourage you to go down a different avenue, maybe explore something new, sit down and read a book with a new perspective. It's not required by school, it's not an obligation of any kind, it's just done out of your enjoyment and your desire to expand your horizons. So if your interest is in any way piqued, then please sit down and stay a while because as long as you're here, I'm here, and I can't wait to start something new with you. So, I thought we would start with a book I read not too long ago called The Book of Dust, the first novel, La Belle Sauvage, by Philip Pullman. Philip Pullman also wrote The Golden Compass, and this is kind of his extensionary work, I guess you could call it. I've always had trouble kind of explaining what this, I guess, incomplete as of yet trilogy is in relation to The Golden Compass, but as it stands, this first book alone is a prequel to the events of The Golden Compass. It happened around 10 years before Lyra's journey when she was still a baby. So this book will be a little bit difficult to understand if you are unfamiliar with just the world of The Golden Compass itself, especially if you haven't read the full trilogy, but I feel like it's quite a good standalone novel in and of itself. It doesn't necessarily fully rely on the context of the universe established in the original trilogy. That being said, I feel like it is incredibly valuable to just read the original Golden Compass trilogy first, but the reason I didn't really start with that one is just because I read it so long ago. I read it much longer ago than I read this prequel. Yeah, I apologize also. I have a tendency to ramble, and I'm also a little bit sick right now, so my voice doesn't normally sound like this. Probably taste the congestion a little bit. I'm just kidding. Yeah, no, but I thought this was a really good book, especially as far as prequels go, just because it does so interesting of a job of establishing things that you would never have guessed from the original trilogy. It establishes completely new characters that somehow end up having pivotal roles in Lyra's life, but it's just completely unclear in the original trilogy because they have no effect on those events. But it reminds you that people are not, especially book characters, are not just who they are in the short window of time that we're with them for a book. They have lives outside of that hypothetically extend past the pages of a series, which is really interesting to think about. And I think Philip Pullman really capitalizes upon this kind of unexplored area where prequels aren't really done so often anymore, and when they are, it's never really within the same lifespan of the main character. It's always a little bit before, a little bit after, completely unrelated to the actual main character themselves. But when it actually works like it did in this book, I think it was really cool to see. That being said, it does introduce new characters who are just largely the focal points of this book, which is really great. I thought Malcolm was just, as a person, a really great character, and I think he couldn't have chosen a better secondary or temporary main character better, just because it really allows you to see the resilience that I think is innate in a lot of children, but especially in Malcolm. He really characterizes that. If he took the word resilience and perseverance and kind of boiled it down to what it would manifest itself in as an 11-year-old boy, it would be Malcolm, I think. And that is really a big part of why you end up enjoying the book so much, because you feel for him. He's just a little boy who with his sense of adventure and like innate curiosity got dragged into something that is a little bit bigger than him, but somehow it seems that he's able to handle it. You never feel like he's too immature for the events that are thrown his way. It's like he's just a little boy in a little boat caught up in the greatest flood of their time on the Thames River, confronted by fairies and things that he, as a boy in a world that is largely unaware of magic, should have no business being dragged into, but he still somehow handles it with grace and the reader is never left questioning the reader is never left questioning his competence in those regards, which I think is a really special thing, because it's not something that you see very often, especially because you don't see young protagonists very often. And when I say young, I don't mean like teenagers. I feel like you see that a little bit too often, in my opinion. But I mean like that weird age where the maturity is not supposed to be at the level of adults or even of later teenagers. It's supposed to be the maturity of a child, and that's why it's so surprising when you see protagonists like Malcolm and later Lyra in the actual Golden Compass trilogy that are so poignant and surprising. They just hit you in the face with their genuine honesty, but they still retain a lot of those traits that people find so admirable in children, which I think is really great. Again, encouraging to read the actual Golden Compass trilogy first, because this book is really kind of contingent on that. But I also think it's just a great book that merits its own commentary on its own. So that's what I'm coming at you with. One thing I really like about this book is just the idea it presents that morality can be so deeply misconstrued, and so simply too, not just for children. While they are often the main targets of things that are utterly immoral, but they're presented in such a way that makes it so easy to believe in. But also adults fall victim to this as well, and this is seen so easily, or this is illustrated in this particular book, through the League of Saint Alexander. When you look at it from an outsider perspective as you're reading it, you feel the malice of intent behind the actions of the people who presented it. It's not a normal thing. You understand right away that what they do is not good. And the actions of the people who are in the league, they automatically get under your skin. It's the most annoying thing. It seems like it was put into place just to be an obvious roadblock to the main characters in this novel. They're put into place simply to be an obstruction of correct morals, even though their members think they're acting within the height of morality. So it's so frustrating from an outsider, but you know that it reflects some very real ideas about how easily ideas penetrate the minds of people, especially when they're proposed in a very positive manner. So I think this book does a really great job about that. But more interestingly, I think, though it was an adventure story at its core. It showed between the two main characters, Malcolm and Alice, they originally started off not liking each other. And this isn't like an enemies to lovers thing. This is a very much genuine first impression, continued impression, and then it shows how the relationship between two human beings can change and is ultimately not a result of just impression, but also it's a combination of those things. It's a combination of experience. And once you experience something, you can realize that maybe it's not really their personality that pushed you away from this person. It's just you weren't able to get to a point where what you two have in common was not greater than what was distinct between two people. And once that barrier kind of goes down, you're able to learn so much about another person, and maybe you realize that you actually are more compatible than what you originally thought, which is really shown here between Malcolm and Alice. And they just have a great dynamic because it's not immediately presented. Even throughout the novel, they don't really like each other, but the novel shows the clear foundations. It's like laying down the framework brick by brick of a relationship, a friendship that will last a lot longer and many years into the future, which is later corroborated by the second book in this trilogy. But they're going to be friends. They're going to stay in touch for life. They're bonded by experience, no matter what happens to them in their individual lives, even though they started off their relationship with animosity, which I think is really great. And it also, they're both in charge of their ward. They both are bound by this baby, Lyra, who they both care about, separate of each other. They're not, it's not their child, but they feel such a strong need to care for this baby and to protect her from forces that are evidently, like, they're obviously trying to do her harm. So it's really great. Also, another thing I really like was just like the realness of the peril. Like, it's kind of, it incorporates this magical event that would likely never happen. The streets of London are not going to flood so intensely that they're going to be completely underwater, and that magical things are going to kind of happen and be unveiled by this great flood that is pushing people out of their homes to the point where they're like taking canoes down. It's not Venice, you know what I mean? But at the same time, it just feels kind of real. They break into a pharmacy that is a real, not to spoil it, it wasn't really a spoiler, but they go visit places that are really normal, but they're having this kind of otherworldly experience in their own world, which is great. And back to the point I was making about kind of the connection between Malcolm and Alice, the two kind of main focuses of this novel, it's really interesting because there's also the matter of the gravity of what they're undertaking together, and that bond is really tested during this novel. It's even when they're not quite certain about their own feelings in their own minds yet, they still feel this uncanny obligation to be responsible for the other person. And when push comes to shove, when the climax of their adventure is happening, that bond is tested and it is shown to be true. And that kind of proves to the reader, as well as Malcolm and Alice in that moment, that the bond that they have forged is truly sound. Like, it wasn't clear to them until that moment, which was really great because they're slowly coming together, but they don't really recognize that until it's tested and until it's put to the test in a real scenario. And I mean, for those of you unfamiliar with Philip Pullman's world, basically what happens is every person, just as every person, it has like the concept of a soul. Every person has that soul. In his world, a human soul is split into basically two quote unquote beings that cannot be separated by natural means, basically. Like, they're called demons, but I've privately in my head always referred to them as daemons just to make the distinction, because they're not like malevolent creatures. They're referred to in these books as humans themselves because they're part of the human being to which they're tied. They're one and the same. They're the same person. But they take the form of an animal. So it's but it's also made clear that the gravity of their connection is because they both share the same soul. They're halves of a whole. So it's not the same as a pet, but they do take the form of an animal. And that's also another really great component about this book, because you can, especially Malcolm's daemon Asta, is such a character, and they have characters separate from their humans, which makes it's like a built-in banter, and it's really great because they provide insight that is simultaneously Malcolm's own insight, but also separate from that. It's a different perspective built in, which is technically the same perspective because they're the same person, but it's really an interesting complexity to add to a world that just makes it a little bit different, and that little difference is something that makes all the difference, in my opinion, which is great. And really shows just the thought that goes into writing a book, which is like something I've always thought about. So it's not really specific to this one, but also another thing that I really enjoy is when authors, especially fantasy authors, like most of all fantasy authors, when they take the time to make a world in ways have ties and like parallels to our world, to like the one we know and live in, but also find just the smallest things to change in order to make it feel just a little bit different. And that little bit of difference, I feel like has more of an impact on me as a reader whenever I'm reading something than whatever other like large magic system change there is. Like obviously in your mind it kind of clicks that the magic from their world is just so utterly different from ours that it's a completely different universe, but then you see the connections and you realize like not you can't, as an author, one of their main like tenets I feel like is that you can't change everything about a world. You have to have things that are recognizable to the reader that they can latch onto and kind of form the rest of the world around that. It's like a PVC pipe frame from which you can hang a tapestry. But there are also the things that are not quite, they don't fall quite into either category. Things that I like to exemplify by pointing out this one example from Philip Pullman's writing that I really like, which is the use of his word embark in order to describe certain things. I will always and forever love his use of this word because it literally is a valid word in the English vocabulary. It means electric, but it's not a common word. It's not something that we use to describe electricity. And yet, it gives this uncanny feel to his universe. It characterizes his universe in a way because it makes you feel like it is a world in and of itself. While electricity exists in it, it doesn't exist in the same context as it does in our world. Electricity in our world is embark in theirs. If there's an embark lamp, that's what he'll use to refer to it, not just a lamp. It's not just a lamp because it's not a lamp in the context of our universe, it's a lamp in the context of his, which is so cool. And that's another one of the things that is just, it keeps you coming back to someone's writing, and it will characterize that author's universe and make it just a little bit more memorable, because even if the full plot of a book does not completely and entirely stick to you, you still hold on to these things. And when you eventually, or if you eventually decide to revisit that universe, that is what keeps you coming back, especially little things like that. Sometimes you will remember like the details of a magic system, and if you're lucky, like the wide overarching rules, unless it was your absolute favorite book or the book that you always like will always remember, because we all have a few of those. But if it's a book that you've read that you find that is just not as memorable for you, it's the little things that tie to your memory that give you a fond after image or after effect of that book, not the large like details of the plot, which I think is just a really important factor of any fantasy author's writing when they're trying to write a really effective world, because that's what gives it the character for me. It's everything else, but it's at its core, it's the little alterations you make to everyday life to make it more exciting and to give it that magical, fantastical feel that make you, as the reader, engaged. Finally, when talking about the end of this novel, I feel like it's important to give it the credit that it deserves in terms of it's really in this awkward position where it has to be a standalone novel and it has to end off at a place where it makes sense for it to end off in the context of the larger story that Philip Pullman is trying to tell. Which, fortunately for us, I think he ends up doing really well. I'm not going to spoil the ending, but it leaves us in a place where it makes sense to kind of slot in the events of the Golden Compass in that timeline right between this first book of the Book of Dust and the next book of the Book of Dust, because the next one, called The Secret Commonwealth, is 10 years after the events of the main trilogy, of the Golden Compass trilogy. So it's a very strange structure that he undertakes, but I think he manages to pull it off because he tells a complete and uninterrupted narrative in the span of one novel that somehow manages to fit like a jigsaw into the rest of his picture that he's painted of the world, into the rest of the backstory that he's given about Lyra in the actual Golden Compass trilogy. And yet that backstory is supplemented by a whole world of new perspective, new characters. We didn't know Malcolm existed in Lyra's backstory because she wasn't aware of it. She wasn't aware of him herself. And so we are fed with this wealth of new information in the form of a novel that we didn't even need to have to enjoy the Golden Compass trilogy. The Golden Compass trilogy has so many merits. And once I reread them, once I have more, I guess, qualifications to speak on it after not having read it for so long, I'll be able to kind of talk more freely about it. But it has so many merits in and of itself. It didn't need a supplement, but I feel like in this case, a supplement was productive to just giving us so much more, a revisitation of this world that we didn't know we needed, but is entirely a positive thing that we got that extra information for us to further our knowledge of the universe and just make it into a clearer picture in our minds. And that's part of what I love so much about books, because every single series that you go into has so much potential, especially high fantasy, especially these books that take so long to establish and take so much skill as an author to do correctly and to do well and to be unique in what it presents to the reader and what it gives you and what you can take away from it. But it's just such a great feeling to be able to jump into a new world every time and just feel the potential of any series could do what the Golden Compass did. But could they do it as well? And could they do it in the way that Philip Pullman envisioned it? Definitely not. And that's what makes it so special. And that's what makes the sequel so special. And that's really what I took away from it. So I really hope you enjoyed me talking about the first book in Philip Pullman's relatively new The Book of Dust trilogy, La Belle Sauvage, and it was really great. And I will definitely get better at this podcast thing as it goes on, but for now, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I really hope you enjoy this kind of new thing I'm trying out. I really like it, and I'm really excited to keep talking about the things that make me happy whenever I have the opportunity to. And honestly, I'm just so happy to be here doing this today and to be able to spill my thoughts out onto a digital piece of paper, which is really great. So I hope you do stop by for the next episode, whenever that may be, hopefully in 2 weeks, or maybe even a week if I'm feeling excited. But thank you for listening to the ramblings of a high school junior, just trying to give some good insight on literature she loves. So yeah, thanks for listening. Bye.